to please fill in the course feedback on Plato, and to assure you that it is anonymous to the best of our knowledge. Although, as I've said to one or two people, if I haven't taught you that that's a false promise by now, then I haven't succeeded in the course. So now today I'm going to lecture for about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, and then James is going to come and talk to you about his experiences at Google, apparently. As of a couple of days ago, that was the promise I had, but I was expecting him to be here by now. So if I get to about maybe he'll be coming. No, but if he doesn't turn up, then I will just let you sort of start your presentations early, and we can have a longer discussion. So certainly from my point of view, this is not hopefully going to be an hour's lecture. And I think that's everything I wanted to say beforehand. So today, technological convergence, which is a very grandiose title for what we're actually going to talk about. But really, the idea of today's lecture is to sort of bring together and draw together some of the ideas that we've been talking about and see how they fit together at a higher level on the internet as it functions, as it affects society, and as the different players in the internet interact with each other. So this lecture is largely going to be about things like businesses and their function on the internet, the power relationships between them, the effects of the people's usage of services, particularly social networking services, and the market mechanisms that interplay between telecoms operators, social networking services, and the communication utilities and things like that. So network effects, market mechanisms, and how regulation can or should shape that interplay. So, to give you an idea of how networks themselves, how the physical infrastructure of networks are beginning to converge and come together, what we can see on the left-hand side here is BT, British Telecom's current network architecture, for want of a better word. And you should remember a lot of this from the first couple of lectures. Sorry, the pictures are quite small. But basically what we've got at the moment is we've got a large sort of legacy system where we have lots of different technologies, fiber, copper, various other things connecting to local exchanges that have different capabilities, different speeds, different functions, and they're all sort of thrown off into the internet over various different types of connection with different speeds, different interconnections, and different technologies all working together, and then somehow it all turns up and becomes the internet as we know it. And this is because this is a legacy system that has come out of the phone network, that has come out of various early developments of the internet as we now know it, ISDN lines and things like that, early DSL. And what BT are moving towards now is a much more unified architecture whereby the sort of home to exchange connections still maintain some of the old legacy infrastructure, but then everything basically just gets aggregated over Ethernet, and it goes off into this big cloud that we call the internet, and that's where everything is pushed together. So the idea is that this bundle of mismatched and old legacy technologies are all going to be converging into one unified technology as the internet becomes the main service that is being delivered over these services, and as the various pieces of infrastructure are upgraded. So this is where the technology is beginning to converge, or is looking to converge in the future. So from the technological side to the services that are running and how they are provisioned, we are going to talk a fair bit today about network neutrality or net neutrality and the people's different ideas of net neutrality and where it came from. And one of the sort of earlier statements of what we might recognize as a precursor to net neutrality can be seen in the Pacific Telegraph Act of 1860, which is obviously talking about telegraph lines. And what we see in that act was that messages received from any individual, company or corporation, or from any telegraph lines connecting with this line at either of its termini, shall be impartially transmitted in the order of their reception, excepting that the dispatches of the government shall have priority. So the idea behind this statement is that you would not prioritise a company with whom you have a relationship. You would not prioritise somebody because they had the name Lord something or Sir something in front of their name. You would not prioritise anyone. You simply treat every message as equally important to every other message. So you just pass them on in the order that you got them, except that government gets priority, well, because they're the government and they're the ones that make acts like this. But also they would view it as they could be talking about, I don't know, national secrets or military or diplomatic things that need good quality of service. But generally speaking, the idea here is that everyone's treated equally. There's no preferential treatment. And what we can do from that is to sort of move forward to today and look at Google's guide to net neutrality for Google users. And what we see here is something that is actually quite similar. Broadband carriers should not be permitted to use their market power to discriminate against competing applications or content. Just as telephone companies are not permitted to tell consumers who they can call or what they can say, broadband carriers should not be allowed to use their market power to control activity online. Now, the concept here is that a broadband carrier, the person who is providing your internet connection, should not be influencing in any way, particularly for commercial benefit, the services that you access. And the concern here is that a company that has a relationship with, say, Facebook, may give preferential treatment to accessing the services of Facebook. So if you were on the British Telecom's internet service provider in the UK and BT have negotiated a contract with Facebook, you might find that BT were giving you faster access to Facebook than they were giving you to Google+, for example. That might be the kind of relationship you might see. Or it might be that they give you faster access to Google as a search engine than they do to something like Bing. So the idea here is that broadband carriers should carry traffic relatively agnostically. Now, as I've mentioned before when we talked about net neutrality a couple of lectures ago, a distinction can be drawn, and often is drawn, between services, commercial services, and the type of service. So it may well be that for the purposes of traffic management, for the purposes of quality of service, you may want to give preferential access to Skype so that Skype communications get through quickly, because otherwise Skype won't work. And I mean Skype as in the technology, not Skype as in the company. So voice over IP, you may require instant or as fast as possible communications. But the idea is that you should not do that because it's Skype the company. You should do it because it is a service that requires that for quality of service purposes. But for example, you should not preferentially treat Google over Bing. So this idea of net neutrality has been a large part of the debate in regulation and policy on the internet. Particularly in the US, it hasn't had quite such an effect on this side of the Atlantic. It certainly has been discussed, but the major debates, the major battlegrounds have certainly been in the US. And if we see what the Federal Communications Commission say about this, the network neutrality legislation, consumers are entitled to access the lawful internet content of their choice. The broadband provider does not have a role in saying what you can and can't access, should not have a role in saying what you can and can't access, certainly from the point of view of degrading your service if you try to interact with services that they don't want you to see. Consumers are entitled to run applications and use services of their choice, subject to the needs of law enforcement. So you shouldn't be forced into using a particular web browser, a particular voice over IP provider, a particular instant messenger, a particular email service provider, any of these things. You are the person that chooses what services that you use, the applications that you use to access those services, subject, of course, to the needs to the needs of law enforcement, perhaps to access services or well, we'll leave it there. Consumers are entitled to connect their choice of legal devices that do not harm the network. You should not have to use an Apple computer to access the internet, although I'm not sure anyone here would notice if you weren't allowed to use an Apple computer to access the internet. So if you are connecting a device, as long as that device is legal, as long as it is not something that is going to harm the network, as long as it's not actually a malfunctioning or malicious device, then you have the right to connect what you like to it. The idea that's coming out here is that this is just, they transmit your bits and they should not care what bits they are. They transmit the data, they should be agnostic to that data and where and to whom it's flowing. And consumers are entitled to competition among network providers, application and service providers, and content providers. And this, in a sense, is the core of what all this is about, is the idea that by leveling the playing field, by preventing people from making anti-competitive decisions, then you will get an increased service. This is the free market. This is the idea that you should have a free market. So from this side of the discussion, this side of the debate, I'm sorry, there's lots of quotes in today's lecture because this is to some extent, this is a very opinion-based topic. But what the European Commission has said about national telecommunications authorities is that national telecom authorities will have the powers to set minimum quality levels for network transmission services so as to promote net neutrality and net freedoms for European citizens. So the idea here is that the national authorities who are running a telecommunications provider can say you are not allowed to degrade a service beyond a certain level. You are not allowed to preferentially treat certain services over certain other services. Continuing, and consumers must be informed before signing a contract about the nature of the service to which they are subscribing, including traffic management techniques and their impact on service quality, as well as any other limitations such as bandwidth caps or available connection speed. Now this relates to, obviously the idea of signing a contract before you access the service. So you don't want to get access to your service provider, buy it on a certain set of understandings or rent it on a certain set of understandings, and then find out that they're imposing traffic management on you that you didn't know about beforehand. But particularly this relates to things like throttling of particular services, throttling of BitTorrent traffic to prevent people from peer-to-peer file sharing, or bandwidth caps to prevent you from downloading a certain amount of content without telling you that bandwidth cap was there beforehand. So, for example, T-Mobile is my mobile provider, and I have an unlimited data contract with them on my mobile phone. I have done my best to find out what they mean by unlimited, because very often I haven't, not in an experimental sense, in the sense of talking to T-Mobile to try and find out about this. Perhaps I should try a more experimental approach. But as far as I'm aware, they will cut off the top 1 or 2% of people who are downloading BitTorrents over their mobile phone sort of 24/7. But to a large extent, they're quite good about this. But the idea is that when you sign up to a service, if they're going to cut you off or degrade you or ask for more money after 50 gigabytes, then they need to tell you this beforehand. Further, on the competition side, national telecoms regulators will gain the additional tool of being able to oblige telecoms operators to separate communications networks from their service branches as a last resort remedy. Now, the idea here is that large telecommunication operators, and British Telecom in the UK is a perfect example of this, often will bundle infrastructure alongside service. So in the UK, British Telecom has the monopoly over the infrastructure. Every line that you use to communicate data, every physical line, more or less, on a national scale is owned by BT and maintained by BT and operated by BT. So when regardless of who you buy your internet service provision from, you're still dealing with BT at some level. And that's why if you have a private house in the UK and you buy internet service from, say, Virgin, then it will be a BT engineer who will come around and actually physically connect you up. So the idea here is that in order to prevent that from becoming an unfair advantage to BT, BT are required to have a separate operation for their internet service provision from the monopoly infrastructure provider that they are. So you can force that split. In the UK, the split is already there, but throughout Europe, this is an option for telecoms operators to preserve a competitive market. James, how much time do you want?
10 minutes is probably fine.
Well, you've got 20, so at least. Right. And so that's a little bit about what the European Commission say. Moving down to the United Kingdom, the communications regulator in the UK, Ofcom, when talking about net neutrality and talking about competition on the internet, we've got two quotes here, one from the chairman of Ofcom and one from the CEO of Ofcom. And the first one straight up is, I do see competition law as the answer to many of these issues. So this is about whether we need specific legislation that specifically says anything about net neutrality, whether we need specific regulations that say you must provide equal service to any website or operator or service provider on your networks. Lord Curry's comment was that this should be solved within the boundaries of competition law. If a company is engaging in anti-competitive business practices where they are choking somebody out of the market, or unfairly preferentially treating a particular service operator over another, then that is something that should be handled by competition law. And then the quote from the CEO of Ofcom was that if you have network operators who are dominant or who have market power, charging for prioritization may be anti-competitive. So this is talking about the the large infrastructure providers like BT or even large services like Google. But if a network operator has no market power and is charging for prioritization, then it's a different question. Their activities shouldn't be automatically construed as anti-competitive or necessarily regulated. So the opinion that is coming across here is that what we are worried about is not net neutrality from the point of view of the internet's function or the internet's design or architecture, as we've talked about over the course of this set of lectures, but we should view this entirely as a business case, entirely as is this anti-competitive or is this improving competition? Is this allowing competition on the internet? We're not worried about the architectural side of the internet. So, sorry, excuse me. So that's the idea of net neutrality in its most basic form, and the viewpoints from the US, from the EC at a European level, and from the UK. If we now start talking about social utilities, things like social networking services, for example, then there is a tendency towards strong network effects. Network effects being the idea, generally speaking, that the more people that use a particular service, the more added value there is for that service. Right? So the more people involved, the better the service is. You get added value above and beyond simply the number of people. This is the case with something like Facebook, whereby there may be better social network services out there in terms of functionality, there may be better services out there in terms of privacy policies, there may be better services out there in all sorts of cases, but because everyone is on Facebook, everyone else wants to be on Facebook. Because if you want to find your friends, then they're all on Facebook, because all their friends are on Facebook. And so this idea that Facebook or other services like Facebook have dominance purely because they already have the existing market share of customers. And this has been quoted also for things like Internet Explorer, when it was the case that because Internet Explorer was such a dominant browser in the web browser market, that people would design websites to work on Internet Explorer. And so it would be very difficult for something like Firefox or Safari or Chrome to interact with these websites, because the people who were running them only cared if they worked in Internet Explorer. And you still see this. Another thing that affects competition in these kinds of services are high switching costs. If you want to transfer from Facebook to Google+, for example, and you can't take your data with you, you lose your photographs, your history of statuses, your social network, the links between people. And so it's not a free market in the sense that as a consumer you can just choose a different service provider. You become locked in to the service provider that you're using. So this leads to, as we've said, natural monopolies, where certain utilities, certain providers are dominant. And this is an unavoidable fact of well, to be honest, this is an unavoidable fact of many businesses or many sort of I don't know, economic ecosystems, is this idea of certain utilities that are dominant because they're dominant to a large extent. And so if we want to have a look at this, this is the global map, a global map, of social network usage from June of last year. What you can see is that Facebook is in blue. So this is the world view of who is using Facebook. Now, for a lot of Africa, there's not much data at all. But what you see here is that whilst it's certainly dominant globally, you can see that it's the big player globally. We have got holdouts. Brazil, for some reason, picked up on. Was anyone here on Orkut? Does anyone remember Orkut? Okay. Well, aren't we all old? Yeah, so Orkut was picked up. It was very popular in Brazil, and it remained popular in Brazil even when the rest of the world switched to Facebook. It was what Brazilians used. They were early adopters. They picked it up. They used it, and everyone in Brazil was on Orkut. So everyone who wanted to be on a social network joined Orkut. China, we've discussed in a couple of lectures. Facebook is actually blocked there, so there is there's an extra incentive there not to use Facebook. There's still plenty of Facebook users in China who access it through VPNs and things like that. But largely speaking, you've got the Q Zone as run by Tencent Corporation. And then Russia has this V-Contactor. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Contactor. That is very popular there. And there's various other ones in sort of various other smaller places. But do you have an account on that?
I used to.
You used to. But if we go to December 2011, you can see that a couple of the others have dropped away. So between June and December, Brazil finally gave in and switched over to Facebook. And I think what you will probably see is that the drop-off would have been quite sharp. Once it hits a certain cut-off, then people, everyone's suddenly on Facebook rather than everyone suddenly being on Orkut. So, but Contact is still running in Russia. So, so what you can see from this is that these things become dominant, and the power that they gain can swallow up the smaller ones simply because all of a sudden if you want to talk to somebody in Brazil, then it was fine to be on Orkut. But if you wanted to contact anyone in the US or in Europe, then you needed to be on Facebook. And if you were on Facebook, then why not stay on Facebook? And certainly as new users come up. One of the other things that's very important to remember about these is that Facebook has not been around for very long. And MySpace obviously was to a large extent the big player before Facebook. And I look forward with glee to the day that there's something in place of Facebook, although they'll probably be as evil as Facebook. These sites are evil by default. So anyway, here we go. So what this leads on to is the idea of dominant content providers, certainly on the internet, merging, buying other services to bring extra things into the fold, to bring in more users, to make their services more all-encompassing. Now, one of the biggest ones, one of the older ones in this sort of space that is worth talking about is the hilarious case of MySpace and News Corp. MySpace, at the height of their powers, were purchased by News Corporation for $580 million. And last year they were sold to Justin Timberlake for $35 million. So not the best investment for News Corp, because in that time Facebook rose up, MySpace collapsed and became a dead space. So, however, at the time it was a relatively smart choice. You know, it didn't work out for News Corporation, but there wasn't any reason to believe that it wouldn't have worked out for News Corporation. It was the large player. Now, MySpace had the specific element of you know, it was a good space for bands to put up their music, and there were lots of things going on there. But at that time, it was the dominant provider, and it gave News Corp a good interaction with this next generation communications technology. So it was a reasonable choice to have made. Now, Google and DoubleClick, on the other hand, DoubleClick were the dominant advertising network, the people that served adverts based on click streams. You went to websites, and it was DoubleClick who were presenting you with the adverts. Google, obviously basing their business model around advertising that comes along with their services, by purchasing DoubleClick, got access to the technologies, the intellectual property, the sheer weight of customers that DoubleClick had at that time, and obviously did very, very, very well out of that. And then, you know, lots of companies are doing this. Amazon are the owners of the Wiki Foundation that developed technologies for wiki-like things like Wikipedia and others, and also the Internet Movie Database, which is still a very popular and thorough catalogue of all the films out there that is also a good business model in itself. So having these kind of, I'm trying not to use the word synergy because it sounds very sort of business speak, but these kind of synergies between the large providers and the companies out there that are small enough to be bought up. And to a large extent, the entrepreneurs or the people who've created these services are very happy to be bought out for vast sums of money. Microsoft, obviously, quite recently purchased Skype, which a surprising number of people don't seem to be aware of the fact that Skype is now owned by Microsoft. But I would say that was a very smart business decision. And earlier on, many years ago, I can't remember exactly when, it was about 2000 even, they bought Hotmail, which for a long time before the rise of Gmail was the dominant mail provider. And so this idea of you have your core market, you have your core service, and then you can buy the smaller services that are up and coming and getting space in other markets is very important. So in the modern internet landscape, the thing that is of concern, particularly from a net neutrality point of view, is that the major social networking services, like Facebook, like MySpace before them, could potentially influence a negotiation with an ISP in absence of net neutrality legislation to prevent this. So Facebook, as a dominant provider, could quite easily negotiate a deal with Verizon to deliver their content preferentially. One of the things that came up in the UK quite recently was that BT were developing their next generation network service, and they were going to put local caches near to people's houses. So in the boxes at the end of your street, there would be sort of large hard drives that would store commonly accessed content, so that rather than having to go all the way across the internet to get the latest refresh of the Daily Mail's front page, then they could serve it to you from the end of your street because lots of people have accessed it, so they already know what the content is. But then what they started to talk about when they developed this system was the idea of charging people to have their content in these caches, to be more preferentially treated. And that was when there started to be quite a few concerns about the idea that this was not just an agnostic improvement of the network technology and an agnostic improvement over the quality of service they were providing to their customers. This actually started to be a mechanism whereby BT could invent a whole new source of revenue, a whole new source of profit, but B also could start to be preferentially treating services like Facebook, Google, whoever who had the resources to negotiate that kind of contract. So what this can lead to is this chain of dominance between several large service providers, which entrenches the status quo and prevents smaller competitive organisations from disrupting the market. So if we talk about regulating competition or trying to improve competition, then there is a service called OpenSocial. Now, the idea of OpenSocial was that it would be a free and obviously open API for social networking sites that would allow sites to interoperate smoothly and seamlessly. So that if you wanted to transfer your social networking practices, your social networking life from, say, Facebook to Google+, the idea is that you would be able to click on a button, say, yes, I want to leave Facebook and go to Google+, and all your data would be streamed across into an appropriate format for presentation in Google+. This idea that you would remove this high switching cost for the user. You would allow them to do it. You would just provide a means whereby that data could be moved across. Now, OpenSocial is a success, but a limited success. It's qualified success. It's used by a number of sites out there. LinkedIn, for example, is probably the biggest one I know of that has OpenSocial. But unfortunately, it's quite a limited affair. It was quite buggy when it came out. It hasn't seen the level of adoption you would want. So it allows for certain applications to be developed that work across different services. But this idea of a sort of one-click swap to a different network service, social network service provider never occurred. And obviously, Facebook are not part of OpenSocial. So whilst that market is out there, whilst all these services out there, the smaller second-tier services are out there using it, the dominant market power is not using it. And I imagine Facebook wouldn't implement this until they started to see their stock price plummet even further. But even with this high switching costs reduced, the sheer fact of the network effect, this natural outcome of social networking services, still act as a barrier. If you're on Facebook, it may well be easy to switch over to Google+, but if all your friends are on Facebook and not on Google+, then clicking that button isn't going to do you any good, even if it's very easy to do it. And so as this goes up and down the chain, as this goes all the way from telecoms operator to social network service provider, then this vertical integration limits the amount of choice you've made. Because if you suddenly realize that by switching to Facebook, switching away from Facebook, you lose the high bandwidth preferential treatment that you get from its negotiated deals with your telecoms provider, then there's even less incentive for you to move across and lose all your friends and suddenly have a slower, effective internet connection. Now, this is not the case. This is a hypothetical scenario I'm presenting here, but this is the concern of the people who are proposing net neutrality legislation. So what could people do about this? What I could say is, what could authorities do about this kind of thing? So obviously the first and most obvious answer is to impose interoperability requirements between these dominant utilities and the chains of integration between them. So what you can say is, not only can Facebook be part of OpenSocial, but it is required to be part of OpenSocial. It is required to have good coverage of the OpenSocial API so that it can allow people to easily get out of their service. And also that the chains from the telecommunication providers to the social network providers and to the content providers and things like that must also necessarily be easy to switch and easy for the consumers to access different versions of those chains. So the idea here always is minimizing the barriers between services and allowing you to overcome those barriers as easily as possible in order to gain the competition that to a large extent businesses are very keen on, especially when they're up and coming. So there's a couple of models for the type of regulation that can be put in here that we've seen in the market. The first of these are must-carry obligations. Now, must-carry obligations are exactly what they sound like. They are requirements that certain providers must carry certain types of content, must allow a platform for certain types of content. And the most famous one here is probably cable TV in the US, whereby cable operators are required to carry the signals of local television operators, assuming that they are of a certain power. So assuming that something is a genuine, valid local network television station, then the cable providers are required to carry it, required to carry their signals. And the idea here is that there was, when this was brought in, I can't remember exactly when this happened. But when this was brought in, the idea was that there would be a choking out of the small local stations that didn't have the resource power to force themselves onto the cable companies. So as people were switching over to cable, they would lose the ability to access these small independent providers, and you would just start to get this clumping of large providers, and it would kill off local television. And the same is true for electronic program guides, where you can to list what programs are going to be on at particular times. The second one that is probably more internet dominated, or at least computer dominated, are API disclosure requirements. So as part of the antitrust case against Microsoft back in the 2000s, Microsoft were required to disclose the programming interfaces to their services, to allow application developers, to allow small application developers to develop services from Microsoft for Microsoft products without having to pay huge fees, or without having to have some large licensing fee. Now there were a lot of problems with this, and I'll mention them in a little bit on the next slide. But this is another potential, is that what you do is you say you must give access to your platform to anyone who wants to use it, anyone who wants to develop for it. So Facebook, if you want to develop a Facebook app, then Facebook should be required to give you the information that lets you do that, rather than just allowing large operators to do it and choking out small competitive businesses. And then the final one is simply interconnect requirements, which are that telecommunications operators must interact with smaller telecommunications operators. If you remember right back to the first lecture, this network of networks that make up the internet, and the requirements for peering and communication between them, then this is the kind of thing that you must provide a service to smaller operators. Not necessarily for free, but you must provide that opportunity. So the limitations or the effects or the outcomes of these disclosure requirements, of these regulations, are API disclosure requirements were a nice idea. They certainly forced Microsoft to open up to a large extent. But what kind of came out of this was that Microsoft basically dumped a huge stack of documents on the desk and said, there you go, there are the APIs. You can now go off and use them. And what it was found was that in many cases, they were incomplete, they were poorly documented. I think one of the good examples I have of this is OpenOffice, which is the Office suite that is meant to be interactive with Microsoft Office. And Microsoft were forced to open the doc format, the format for their Word files. And what they found when they were looking at the protocol specification is that there were bits in it, there were functions in it that said things like, format this like Word 6 used to format it. And that was the function that you had to implement. It's like, so without knowing specifically the ins and outs of how Word 6 did it, you were looking at this API, and anyone outside of it couldn't reasonably speaking implement these functions. So, whilst API disclosure sounds like a good thing and certainly is a good thing, it's certainly limited in what it can really achieve. Must carry obligations, on the other hand, do enable one platform to break into another. So, for example, there is a Flickr app on Facebook. As I understand, it wasn't actually developed by Flickr. I think it was developed by somebody else. But this idea that Facebook, as a direct competitor to Flickr in the photograph, people uploading photograph market, Facebook would be quite happy for Flickr not to have its service on Facebook. It would much rather that people uploaded all their photos to Facebook. But this must carry obligation enables Flickr to integrate and to allow people who want to use Flickr for the things that they want to use Flickr for, and to use Facebook for the other things for which they want to use Facebook. But interconnect requirements to a large extent are probably the most likely way to lead to this seamless user experience. This idea that you have to provide a means to interconnect with other services. You have to provide a means to shift and switch between the services that you want, because that creates a real level of competition. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and I will hand over to James.